I want to welcome you to the University of Scranton this evening. I'm pleased to serve the university as the Director of Community and Government Relations, and I want to thank you for joining us for a special lecture. We're honored to have here this evening His Excellency Archbishop Bernardito Auza. He is the Apostolic Nuncio and the permanent observer of the Holy See to the United Nations. He's here to speak with us about global migration, shared responsibility, and solidarity. The Archbishop's work at the United Nations has very real national and local implications, whether in regard to how many refugees the United States accepts, which is set for a historic low in 2019, or in how we treat those who are undocumented among us. Over the past few years, the university has worked to respond to a variety of migration issues. We have started a refugee solidarity initiative. We've partnered with Catholic Social Services of the Diocese of Scranton in their work to resettle refugees and work with immigrants, which is in keeping with our region, northeastern Pennsylvania's longstanding immigrant roots. In particular, we've tried to heed Pope Francis's call to make personal connections, to think of those who are migrating, not as numbers, but as persons with their own names, stories, and families. Tutoring has been offered by university students, an accompaniment program has paired faculty and staff with refugee families, and Global Taste of Scranton community celebrations. All of these things have helped us to get to know our refugee neighbors, which has truly been a blessing. And we're pleased to have with us tonight some guests from our local refugee community, including from the Democratic Republic of Congo, and also staff from Catholic Social Services, so we're so glad that you're here with us tonight. The university has also sought to show solidarity with those who have been migrating from Central and Latin America, coordinating delegations and service trips to better understand the stark realities at the U.S.-Mexico border. We've also advocated for the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program, DACA, calling for protection of undocumented students brought to the United States as children, including students here at the University of Scranton. And so we're grateful to have Archbishop Auza on campus tonight to give us an international perspective and also to share with us the Holy See's efforts as we continue to learn here and to think about how we can expand our efforts. I want to thank some of the campus offices that have been part of these different initiatives and also co-sponsored tonight's lecture: the Refugee Solidarity Initiative, the Ella Korea Initiative, Political Science and Peace and Justice Studies, Campus Ministries Center for Service and Social Justice, and the Catholic Relief Services Ambassadors Club. And you'll have a chance to hear from members of the Refugee Solidarity Initiative and the Ella Korea Initiative a little later. They'll share some questions and comments with the Archbishop. I also want to thank Dr. Eugene Haluka, a parent, a university parent who has helped in arranging tonight's lecture and other previous special lectures. And now I'm pleased to introduce the university's provost and senior vice president for academic affairs, Dr. Jeff Gingrich, who will be introducing our speaker.
Thank you, Julie. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming out for this important moment at the university tonight. It's the university's honor to host this evening someone who works tirelessly on behalf of the Catholic Church to advance peace, justice, human dignity, and humanitarian cooperation. His Excellency Archbishop Bernardito Auza is the Apostolic Nuncio and permanent observer of the Holy See to the United Nations. He also serves as the permanent observer of the Holy See to the Organization of American States and is the titular Archbishop of Suacia. Tonight he will be talking about global migration at a time when individuals and families, including many children, continue to flee their homes, whether due to violence or conflict or the scourge of poverty. Archbishop Auza is a voice for the Holy See on the plight of refugees and migrants, as well as many critical issues being addressed at the United Nations. At a recent Security Council open debate on mediation and settlement of disputes, Archbishop Auza spoke about the importance of patient dialogue and negotiation in pursuit of just and peaceful resolution of conflicts. He shared Pope Francis's notion of a culture of encounter, which promotes mutual respect and understanding, not only in worldwide disputes, but also in how we deal with one another on a daily basis. Archbishop Auza has also been at the forefront of UN debates on the environment and climate change, human trafficking, the plight of children in armed conflict, human rights and the rule of law, threats to religious pluralism and religious freedom, and more. In this work, he is always bringing Catholic social doctrine, a belief in the inherent dignity of each human person, to bear on the most pressing issues of the world. Born in the Republic of the Philippines, Archbishop Auza was ordained a priest in 1985. He earned a doctorate in theology and entered the diplomatic service of the Holy See in 1990. Since then, he has served in a variety of posts in several different countries, including at the Apostolic Nunciature of Madagascar, Bulgaria, and Albania, and in the Secretariat of State in the Vatican. In 2008, he was ordained Titular Archbishop of Suacia, as well as Apostolic Nuncio of Haiti, which included serving in Haiti during that country's devastating 2010 earthquake. Archbishop Auza has served in his current role at the United Nations since 2014. So please join me in welcoming His Excellency, Archbishop Bernardito Auza, to the University of Scranton.
Father Scott, dear members of the faculty of the University of Scranton, dear friends, dear students, thank you for inviting me to share with you some thoughts on certainly one of the greatest challenges of our time, and also, without a doubt, one of the defining pastoral priorities of our Holy Father, Pope Francis, and of the entire Catholic Church, namely the mass movements of people practically never been seen in history, with probably the only exception during and after the Second World War. On the 13th of July this year, July 13, 2018, delegations to the United Nations Conference on Migration informally adopted what is now called the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration. That has been the product of intense work of all the countries in the world and all the other stakeholders, including universities like yours, faith-based organizations like Catholic Relief Services or the Jesuit Refugee Service, etc. I would like to contextualize this global compact and within this phenomenon of massive movements of people. Just consider this. In 2017, 258 million people crossed international borders. 68.5 of these people were forced from their homes. Refugees in 2017 grew to almost 27 million from around 11 million in 2010. An increase of more than 60% in only 7 years. These are just some of the figures that tell us why the international community has come together and decided to come up with a compact, or it is not a convention because it is not legally binding. It is not a mere political declaration, but they call it a global compact as a kind of a compromise in order to have a framework for international cooperation on how to confront the challenges that come with massive movements of people. I'm sure that especially people who are directly interested in the question of migration, I'm sure that at least during the last decade, you have seen and read so many videos and articles about the migration crisis in Southern Europe, especially in the Mediterranean. People were dying, drowning, or just disappeared in the desert. In September 2018, that is just last month, 1/5, that's 20% of the migrants and refugees who tried to cross the Mediterranean from Libya to Italy or Greece perished. They drowned or simply disappeared. That's 20%. In 2014, there was this big push of forced migrants in the Mediterranean. And in 2015, there were even more forced migrants and refugees crossing to Greece than to Italy. Italy, which has always been in that part, the country is a frontier country for the European Union, so it has been the country that received most migrants and refugees. But in 2016, something happened. The wars all over the Horn of Africa, the Middle East, and as far away as Afghanistan. One of the most discussed consequences of this European migrant crisis has been the rise, and in a number of countries, the conquest of power, in many, by movements and political parties with strict or clearly anti-immigrant political platforms. Even in countries where the integration of the migrants was thought to be accomplished, like Sweden or Canada or Italy, so-called anti-immigrant parties have emerged, creating governance challenges in those countries. Italy is now governed by a center to the extreme right parties, and its platform has clearly left, we might say, the Italian tradition of being welcoming to migrants. Of course, they are complaining that the other parts of the European Union have not been helpful and that they have not been in solidarity with Italy or Greece in trying to not only manage, but to welcome and to give a worthy integration of these migrants to these countries. Who are these people on the move? And why do they move? What are the main drivers of migration? There are, of course, many factors that drive migration. You could generally divide them into two: the so-called push factors, or factors that drive people to leave their homelands to go somewhere else, and the so-called pull factor. Those are the factors that make people move to a particular space or to a particular country. The push factors are, the number one push factor now is war and conflict, violence, insecurity, human rights violations, massive atrocities and violations of fundamental human rights, and lack of opportunity, extreme poverty. The pull factors that attract people to go somewhere else, we know them also, like the search for better opportunities and changes in labor markets. As we always say, nature hates the vacuum. That's why wherever there are work or jobs available, people in search of work go there. I think that's very normal. During these last years, the biggest reason, as I've said, why people have moved is violence, war, and conflict. According to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, the top 3 nationalities of entrance of the over 1 million Mediterranean Sea arrivals between January 15 and March 2016, it's only a period of 14 months, 47% of these arrivals are Syrians. 21% are Afghans. Oh, long, long way. And 9% are Iraqis. So what is the common denominator of these 3 countries? War, conflict. Wars and conflicts are also the reasons why the top 10 countries with the most migrants and refugees are Asian and African countries. Jordan, Turkey, and Pakistan are the top 3 biggest migrant destinations, not because they are much wealthier than their neighbors, not because they are much more peaceful than their neighbors, but they are simply a little bit better than their neighbors in terms of peace and security situation. Those who are in Jordan are, of course, mostly Syrians, and then the Palestine refugees. Those who are in Turkey, more than 2 million are Syrians and Iraqis, and those who are in Pakistan are mostly Afghans. They border, therefore, countries at war. And the other countries among the top 10 with the most migrants and refugees are all also in Asia and Africa. You have Lebanon. There are around 6 million Lebanese citizens, and there are around 2.7 million forced migrants and refugees. So think about it, 1 for every 2 Lebanese is a migrant or a refugee. Just like saying that there are 150 million migrants and refugees in the United States out of 300 million. If you are now almost 360, 380 million, that means you would have around 170, 180 million migrants and refugees in the United States. Jordan is more or less in the same situation. Another driver of migration, of global migration, is extreme poverty. I think there is no need to explain that. People move in search of better economic opportunities for themselves and for their families. It has been debated whether poverty, in particular extreme poverty, contributes to migration. Some thought that the poorest often cannot migrate since resources and proper documentation are needed to do so, especially for international migration. This has led to much debate about the relationship between migration and development, in particular whether development can reduce the pressures that drive migration or, in fact, can stimulate more migration by giving people the resources to move. I think that is a legitimate question. In the context, anyway, of my actual context, my actual experience with migrants, this is only partially true. I don't know what you think about that. Poor people do move in spite of the lack of resources to move and in spite of the lack of proper documentation. Haiti, for instance, around 1 million Haitians out of 11 million people migrate to the Dominican Republic across the border. Most of them, of course, are what we call irregular migrants, or what we used to call illegals. But now, of course, that's not the correct term now, is irregular migrants. They are very poor. They have no education at all. And around 65 of the Haitians don't even have birth certificates, much less a passport. And yet they move. And how many Haitians are also moving to Florida? If it were possible for them only to arrive there, then everybody would be moving, in spite of the fact that practically 65% of the Haitians live in extreme poverty. So I do believe that there is truth in one argument or the other, but I do believe, anyway, that extreme poverty is really more of a push factor why people move. People move to look for better opportunities. But it is not only poverty itself that drives people to move. If all the countries were poor and equally poor, what's the use of moving except for the fact just to exercise your right to migrate? The other side of the coin is that people from poor and extremely poor countries move because there is a great inequality, economic inequality among countries, and between countries. So that is also a consideration. In the Global Compact, another category of people is recognized. It has been a huge debate. These are the so-called climate change migrants. People move because of grave environmental degradation in their places. Or people move also because of sudden natural catastrophes, just like huge typhoons in the Philippines or hurricanes in the Atlantic, etc. Puerto Rico is one example. So many of them, hundreds of thousands, went to Orlando or to Miami or to New York because of that disaster. But the recognition that people, poor or wealthy, had to move away from where they are because of climatic changes is something new and is not yet a settled question. Anyway, after such an overview of the global phenomenon of migration, I would like to focus on this Global Compact for Safe, Orderly Migration, because now it is not yet formally adopted. It will be formally adopted in Marrakesh, Morocco, if you want to go to Marrakesh. I couldn't give you the ticket, but it will be there on 10 and 11 December this year, that there will be the so-called United Nations Intergovernmental Conference to adopt the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration. That's just one of the shortest titles of the United Nations. Anyway, it is going to be adopted there, and they are expecting people, heads of state and heads of government to come. The Holy Father wanted to come, and he almost decided to come, but something else happened, and he is not going there anymore. So this Global Compact is what will be the international framework of cooperation for migration. It has been a very difficult thing to achieve. One would only give an example of the United States pulling out of the process in early December or in November 2017. And Hungary is not going to sign it. And Austria will not sign it. And Poland is also planning not to sign it. And Australia and so many other countries with very strong reservations that sometimes it looks as if this Global Compact would not have really that effect that we desire it to have. This Global Compact for Safe, Orderly, and Migration came from two important, big United Nations documents. You know, in 2013, 2014, 2015 was the start of what they called the European migration crisis. Sometimes I will think that, until the migration crisis came to Europe, there was not much energy and not even much political will, even at the level of the United Nations, to deal with the question. And to think that 85% of forced migrants and refugees are hosted by the countries I just mentioned. 85% are hosted in those 10 countries: Jordan, Lebanon, Turkey, Pakistan. They are not certainly very wealthy countries. And yet, when in 2017, 2016, around 1 million forced migrants and refugees applied for asylum in Europe, it became a crisis. And to consider that Europe is a wealthy community of 365 to 400 million people, with some countries having a per capita income of around 140,000, 150,000 a year. So it certainly is not a poor place. Anyway, so this pressure was really costed political will to come up with something that would bind the international community in its governance or management of this phenomenon. So in 2015, probably you've heard of the most ambitious document that the United Nations has ever produced. It's called the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. That was another 5-year negotiations for us. And then with that, one of the targets is to manage international migration, to have a framework, to come up with a framework to manage international migration. And then finally, in 2016, another document which practically came out of that promise, of that objective, of the target of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development was also adopted. It's called the New York Declaration. It's really the New York Declaration for Migrants and Refugees, which was the outcome document of the September 2016 Summit on Migration and Refugees. So all these things, just imagine these two very important documents. In 2015, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, and in 2016, the summit of the presidents and prime ministers, etc., in New York to come up with this New York Declaration on Migrants and Refugees. And these migrants and refugees, in its Annex 2, said that we, the international community, will come up with a global compact. So that started the ball rolling. So the entire year of 2017 until July 2018, this global compact was negotiated. Lots of preparatory meetings, lots of submissions, lots of consultations, etc., etc. The Holy See, all these processes have been very active, and I must say we have really substantial contribution in the New York Declaration, and above all in the Global Compact. So finally, in December 2017, the whole preparatory process was concluded with what we call the stock-taking conference in Puerto Vallarta in Mexico. A few days before that, I would say probably 10 or a week before that, the United States decided to pull out of the process. It joined the preparatory processes, and then probably we saw that it was not going the way it wanted. So the United States pulled out from the conference in Mexico. And a month after that, exactly in February, early February, February 5, 2018, this year, finally what we call the zero draft, the first draft of the Global Compact was issued. During the stock-taking conference in Puerto Vallarta, the Holy See really worked hard to try to put these fundamental principles that we believe should underpin the Global Compact. And I will say more later on that. And so this was, in Puerto Vallarta also was the first time at the opening ceremony of the conference that the video, the 3-minute, 34-second video of the Pope explaining the 4 verbs that really summarize our teaching, our belief on what migration is really summarized. I'm sure you have seen that video. It's a 3-hour-and-a-half video. I would have wanted to bring it, but anyway, it is the Pope himself explaining migration. And to summarize his teaching on migration, he spells out these 4 verbs. Course, to protect, to promote. To welcome is the first. To welcome, to protect, to promote, and to integrate. To protect, to promote, to welcome, to protect, to integrate. And these are really also our fundamental contributions to the whole process. Now, during what we call the intergovernmental negotiations, that's the formal negotiations for the Global Compact, was conducted during 6 intense rounds during the months from February to July this year. And when I saw the first draft of the Global Compact, we call the zero draft, my reaction was really positive to highly positive. Because in the draft, you could see traces and footprints of the Holy See's contributions to the process. Even the structure of, you are familiar with the Global Compact, I could suppose, at least some of those who are working in the migration field. The Global Compact, of course, has a preamble and its vision and principles, and then the heart of it are 23 objectives. And then under each objective, there are what we call commitments. The word commitment itself was a big quarrel because some people just wanted to say policy guidelines instead of commitments. Anyway, that's another thing. Otherwise, I wouldn't finish if I would go that far. These 23 objectives really reflect, almost mirrors the 20 action points. It is a document that we use as our formal contribution to the drafting. It's called the Recommendations of the Catholic Church, the 20 action points. You know, what migration, or what does the church do about migration, and what does the church recommend about migration, etc., etc. So even there, just the structure of the Global Compact itself, I think, is a huge positive thing for us. The commitments are spelled out, and then the commitments under each objectives are also well spelled out. I would just mention some of the elements of this Global Compact which the Holy See considers to be really positive for us. By the way, next month there will be a kind of a conference, a seminar in the Vatican, during which Catholic organizations, the Vatican itself, and conferences of bishops, Catholic organizations dealing with migration would come together and try to find out how the Catholic Church could help really in the implementation of the Global Compact. I think it's going to be a very important meeting. But I just came back from there, so probably I will send somebody else on our part. Anyway, there are many positive things in the Global Compact. But I would just like to mention some that I believe are really some of our best contributions to the whole process. The first, of course, it's not only the Holy See to say this, but we were always insisting. The first is the recognition. This is a kind of an enveloping principle of the Global Compact. It's the recognition that migration is a natural, positive phenomenon and contributes to development when it is voluntary, safe, orderly, regular, and well managed. I mean, you could add more adjectives to that. It said that because it was during the preparation, during the debates in preparation for the drafting, there were some countries who did not recognize the right to migrate, who did not recognize that migration contributes positively to development. So just to have this principle inserted as something that binds all the other things together, I think was a very important achievement. And we certainly contributed much to that by insisting day in and day out about the importance of this phenomenon. From this principle flows many of the past objectives, which look at migration as something contributive to development. Like, for instance, that countries are invited, countries are asked to open more regular pathways of migration, especially when it comes to jobs, occupations, and family unification. That's one of the other effects there. And empowering migrants and societies to realize the full inclusion and social cohesion. These are just some of the many principles, good principles that flow from this vital recognition that migration is not a negative phenomenon. It could be negative, of course, when it is not ordered, when it is not voluntary, etc. Refugees, forced migrants, these are certainly huge humanitarian challenges, but we don't want migration to be that way. And that's why we want this global compact in order to have a global, better managed and regular migration. The second fundamental principle, which we think really is positive, is this global compact is person-centered. It's human-centered, and it is repeated in many parts of it, from the preamble to the objectives. The term human-centered or person-centered approach has gained good traction, I must say, at the United Nations documents recently. The Holy See has kept on hammering and repeating this principle across so many years. And I believe that it has gained some importance in the wording of many United Nations documents. The 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development itself has mentioned this person-centered approach all over the place. And its core principle that no one will be left behind is really an expression of a human-centered approach. The Global Compact states that it places individuals at its core. It's in paragraph 15. So that's the second, I think, very fundamental value that is there. It looks at the individual. It looks at the person. The third principle, which I believe, which is objectively very, very important, is the full respect for the fundamental rights of every migrant, regardless of their migration status. Again, that's a big quarrel. You just could imagine how much quarrel there was, because it said, if you give all the services to all migrants, regardless of their status, you are only encouraging migration. Most of the European countries would say that. But it is also in international humanitarian law and international law that you cannot deny basic services that flows from the fundamental human dignity and fundamental human rights. The Holy See insisted that there should be an enumeration of these fundamental services that every country cannot deny to any migrant regardless of his or her migration status. But it was not accepted. But I believe that the formulation of this respect for the fundamental human rights, regardless of migration status, is very clear there. It is there, and it's repeated in many places. Under this theme of the protection of the fundamental rights of the migrants, there was also a principle that together with other countries, we really insisted until the end. And probably you have heard of this principle. It's called the principle of non-refoulement. Refouler, of course, in French, which means to return, to send back. The refoulement is you cannot send a migrant or a refugee. Of course, a refugee cannot be sent home because it's governed by the Geneva Conventions. But you cannot send here in this context a migrant whose life might be in danger in his own country of origin if he is sent back. That is the right. Now, the principle of non-refoulement is now accepted, universally accepted as a customary international law. So you cannot deny that. The problem was some very, very big countries opposed the inclusion of this principle of non-refoulement because it said that international law only provides non-refoulement for refugees and not for migrants. Of course, the question here of the migrants is that, many migrants are supposedly voluntary, which is not always true. If you have 68 million forced migrants out of 258, then it is not true. But however, as a compromise, the very definition of non-refoulement is in the text. That's how the way negotiations go. Even though the principle does not appear there, everything is there. So you cannot send a migrant back to his or her country of origin if it means kind of putting him in danger, for instance, for political reasons, or for criminality reasons, etc. And the fourth principle that I would like to mention, I have to go fast because I'm already over time, is the principle of shared responsibility. It is there. It's very important because the Global Compact is supposedly an expression of the unity of purpose, a common understanding of what migration is, and then the acceptance of our shared and common responsibility towards the migrants. The fifth principle that I would like to mention, it has a very strong language on family and children. This, I think, also of our principal contributors, because we really insisted on family unification and opening new pathways in order to facilitate family unification. And we insisted the banning of child detention. We did not achieve that, but I think the language in the Global Compact is still very good. It says that all countries must work towards putting an end to child migration and putting an end to detention of migrants as a measure of migration. The sixth principle I'd like to mention is that migration is a two-way process. I think that's very understandable. One of the most common misunderstandings of migration is that migration causes social chaos and it breaks social cohesion. I think I don't have to explain that because we do believe that migration, if there is proper integration and proper understanding of the mutual responsibilities of host communities and countries and the migrants themselves, especially when it comes to the question of respecting the culture and the laws of the host communities. The seventh and the last positive thing that I would mention, in order to stay biblical, 7, is the inclusion of the faith-based organizations as one of the major stakeholders of migration, of the response to migration. So the Global Compact now recognizes faith-based organizations as important, especially in the implementation of this Global Compact. It is one of our specific contributions. Many countries agreed with that, but they did not want to voice explicitly their support. But we work hard on that, and finally, in the final draft resolution, it is an accepted fact that faith-based organizations are first responders and very important first responders on the ground, and also in terms of advocacy before governments. So these are just some of the positive things that I would say about the Global Compact. Reservations, do we have reservations? Really, I think there is only one serious reservation that we have. Only one reservation. And that is in the Global Compact has cited 3 documents which have not been negotiated. These are documents put out by experts. And so he said that you cannot put a non-negotiated document in a negotiated document. Of course, they agree with that, but they said that once you open up that whole thing, you will never finish. But the reason also why we oppose these documents is that, one of them is proposing, pushing, recommending abortion kits for humanitarian aid, and pushing for abortifacients and abortion as a response to migration and refugees, difficult situations. Of course, we cannot accept that. Other than that, I would say, if you haven't read the Global Compact, especially those whose work is directly related to it, I think I would highly recommend that you read it and find out for yourselves what are the principles that resonate more with your work. I think that's the only way, or that's the best way that you could learn more about this global and shared responsibility on migration. So I must end by saying that the Global Compact is now, even though it's not formally adopted, is now the international framework for global and shared responsibility towards migrants. There is a parallel Global Compact on refugees, but this Global Compact on migration is the first ever. There has never been a Global Compact or an international document on migration. This is historic, and this is the first. And I believe if countries, organizations communities would look at it for guiding principles and some best practices in other parts of the world, then I believe that it will come to life. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Archbishop Auza, for your comments and for all the work that you're doing at the United Nations. Whoops. At this time, I'm going to call on some university colleagues to share their questions and engage in some discussion. So I'm going to ask them to come up, and as they come up, I will introduce them. So we have Dr. Mike Allison, Professor of Political Science and Coordinator of the Ella Korea Initiative. He has just returned from a trip to El Salvador for the annual meeting of the Jesuit Migration Network of Central America and North America, and that's very good news that the faith-based institutions are being recognized for their important role. Dr. Helen Wolf, Executive Director of Campus Ministries, which also includes the university's ISP program, the International Service Program, and she's also the chair of the Refugee Initiative. And last but not least, Bridget McGuire. She's a member also of the Refugee Initiative, and she's a junior majoring in international studies, and she helps coordinate our refugee tutoring program. So they're going to share some comments and offer you some further questions. Dr. Allison, did you want to start and just put your, yeah.
All right. Thank you, Your Excellency. I think it's extremely important that the international community is taking the time and making the effort to come up with a framework for us to deal with the global migration challenges confronting the world. I guess one question I had, which you began to hit on at the very end, was perhaps to talk a little bit more about interreligious cooperation around migration. I think it's something that, three of the world's major religious traditions feel very strongly about. And if you could just talk about some of the challenges and opportunities for faith-based organizations and the different religious traditions to address migration issues.
Thank you very much. During the final push for the inclusion of the faith-based organizations in the Global Compact, the Holy See Mission to the UN, I organized a very big conference of religious leaders at the United Nations. And so we brought the president of the International, Caritas International, Cardinal Tagle, and major proponents of the other religions, and made them talk to many delegations who were present, many ambassadors who were present, about what does each one's religions say about migration. So actually, in the end, there was so much commonality when it comes to migration. We ourselves, our Christian vision of treating the migrants comes from the Jewish tradition in the Old Testament, etc., etc. So there are some challenges when it comes to confronting specific problems, but when it comes to a basic vision of how to treat the migrants and how migrants in their each religious tradition, there was so much commonality. So I believe when you working in the ground, I'm pretty sure those who really work in the ground have a much better experience than being conceptual like we do at the United Nations. That, whether you are dealing with the World Vision or the Islamic Humanitarian Relief Organization, or you are doing with the Lutheran International Federation, etc., then you will find lots of commonalities when it comes to treating migrants. And I think, besides the fact also that treating migrants, especially when it comes to fundamental human rights, are not only based on one's religious beliefs, because of course that's the most profound, you might say, conviction that you have of why you treat human beings this way. But many of the fundamental requirements or values why you treat migrants this way are also part of international law and part of international humanitarian law. So even when you are not dealing with religious faith-based organizations, you are dealing with other agencies or agencies without religious affiliation, then you will also find many commonalities.
Bishop Auza, I want to thank you for the work that you're doing on behalf of our church. The stance that the Catholic Church has taken on respecting the dignity of the migrant has always been something that's made me so proud to be Catholic. So thank you for all you've done. I have a question about the non-binding status of the Global Compact. maybe you could speak a little bit to what the UN is doing or has talked about doing to encourage administrations that are hostile to migrants and how they could be encouraged to accept the Global Compact.
Yeah, one of the fundamental questions that had to be resolved even before the start of the whole process, even before the preparatory process, was whether or not this document would be binding or not. And of course, the receiving countries, what they call the wealthy countries, most of all the United States, the European Union, China, they said absolutely it cannot be binding document, otherwise we will just pull out even before it starts. So this non-binding, the non-binding character of the document was defined from the very start. Now, of course, this does not mean that although it is not binding, countries are not obliged to observe what are already provided for in international law and above all in international humanitarian law. For instance, as I've said, the basic services that a host country must provide to a migrant person, regardless of his or her migrant status, must be provided not because of the Global Compact, but because of international humanitarian law. So you are bound by that international humanitarian law, so you must provide all the services anyway. The problem with the question of sovereignty is that most, again, they are not a majority, but they are very powerful. And when it comes to negotiations, even if just one country would say no to an agreement, then that agreement wouldn't go forward. So it's that they said that each country is sovereign in making their migration policies. That was a fundamental principle that these countries put forward even before the start of the meetings. Now the question is really how this Global Compact is implemented in countries, first of all, in countries that welcome it, that accepted it, and by faith-based organizations, by civil society, even in countries that do not accept this Global Compact. In the United States, for instance, the United States did not participate in the formal negotiations. The United States believed that it has sovereign right to define its own migration policy, but it doesn't mean that there will be obstacles. There will be hindrances for faith-based organizations and other organizations working in this area of migration. They will put many obstacles. There will be lack of funding, etc. But it does not mean that you cannot try to implement the provisions or the recommendations of the Global Compact even in the United States. You can, but of course the government, especially in those areas where you could easily implement the Global Compact, either because the United States could not say no because it is an international law, it is an international humanitarian law, or because the United States and the people of the United States actually believe in them, but externally they say that it's not their policy. So I'm sure that many local governments, many official institutions are still willing to collaborate with you on these matters because they too believe, convinced in their hearts that what you do is right.
So thank you again for speaking tonight about global migration, which is such an important topic, especially in the world today. So here at the university, we've started a tutoring program for refugee children in the area, and while we've had a lot of successes with the program, one of the problems that we seem to have encountered is having students come to the program sometimes. So my question is, when are instances that you've seen successes of, or what are suggestions that you have for making refugees feel welcome in our community, for coming to our campus, and for coming to programs such as this?
There is, unfortunately, a lack of understanding, much of the lack of understanding in the situation of refugees and forced migrants above all, and migrants secondarily, I mean voluntary migrants, is the lack of a global knowledge of what is going on in the world, of what is going on in the other parts of the world. It is only one. It's not the only. It's not the only reason. But really kind of consciousness raising initiatives which would primarily first try to increase knowledge among students, among parishioners, etc., of what is happening in other parts of the world and the reasons why these people have become refugees. I think one would be, I don't know what kind of heart you would have if you cannot even understand, I would not even demand empathy of, let's say, people, Christians and other religious and ethnic minorities fleeing the persecutions from Daesh or ISIL, from the Islamic State. I wonder how one, if one knows exactly what's happening in northern Iraq, in the Nineveh Plains, where the ancient Christian communities have always lived, and now they're driven out. It would be very difficult. Once they know these things, I believe it would be very difficult for them to completely have a closed heart and welcoming heart for these refugees. Or even if they don't want refugees here, at least it would open their hearts to help these people. We have big drives, campaigns, and it's these people. When I was in 2015 and 2016 into 2017, those were the heights of the persecution of Christians in the Middle East. And then these, the Jesuit Refugee Service, CRS, and Caritas Internationalis, and all those people advocating for them would come see me. Some people would say, could you please ask Pope Francis to decide for them whether they should leave or not? Because their lives are in danger, they would be killed, etc. I said, unfortunately, I could not be helpful in that. Nobody would decide whether they should stay or not. It is their own decision between them and God. I said, if they think that their lives are really in danger, then they should leave. But that's why I said, the best thing, of course, is the long fight for equality, the long fight that their religious freedom is recognized, the long struggle that they would be recognized as equal before the law with other citizens who are, let's say, in the majority or whatever. That's the long-range thing. But in the short run, when we do campaigns, should we receive these people as refugees for now? Because refugees do not necessarily stay. Refugees in general would come back. The asylum seekers usually would stay. But many refugees don't even seek asylum to be admitted as asylum. They want to go back. So what is now our primary duty? So it's not only helping refugees, above all, helping them to return. And that also is very costly. We have, as a church, we have this huge, ambitious project to rebuild the Nineveh Plains, the villages there, so that the Christians would have reason to go back, so that the Christians would stay, help them, have a scale economy, help them to live, open up schools again, give them work. Of course, something that we cannot provide is security. The first thing that all the Christians and minorities in Syria and in northern Iraq, they think the primary, and for them, if it were the only one that they would ask, is security, peace and security, that they are left alone. They would not even, they would not even ask for humanitarian aid. We will survive, but please give us security. Unfortunately, who could provide security if not their states, their own governments? Christians in the north of Iraq have been asked, why can't you form your own militias like the other minorities so that you can defend yourselves? We will never do that. You will just be perpetuating, another cycle of violence and another difficulty that instead of being recognized, we want to be recognized as equal to all the citizens of Iraq. We don't want to be discriminated against because of our religion or because of our ethnicity. We are all Iraqis, so that's what we want. But that is a very, very long-term project. So, again, I think I strayed from your questions. Truly, I think advocacy, certainly, consciousness raising is one of them. If you have you could target several situations because, the world is so complex. There are just so many situations. Why are people fleeing from South Sudan? Why are people fleeing from Eastern Nigeria? Why are people dying in Somalia or there are so many other causes. It becomes huge, and it could become so complex, especially before people who are not in the first place very interested. So you could focus, for instance, say, why are the refugees in our place? You know, they are the victims of war, they are the victims of religious discrimination. So it's easier for people to get their attention and to digest. What are you aiming at? You know, you want to raise their consciousness, you want to raise their empathy, so you want to raise their willingness to help. And of course, their overall interest in the plights of people who are in very, very vulnerable situations. Thank you. My response was very long.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your comments and your further discussion, and thank you to my colleagues for all the work that you're doing. And we will continue the work here in Scranton. And now it's my honor to introduce our president, Reverend Scott Pillars of the Society of Jesus, to offer his closing remarks.
Great. Thank you all for being here this evening. It's an important night for the university, a great night for us to learn about the efforts of the church and the leadership and inspiration that the Archbishop is providing. Here at Scranton, we have several initiatives moving forward on these issues, and I pledge my support and the support of the university to continue them. So again, thank you very much for a wonderful night and the enlightenment that you've provided with us and the inspiration you give to us as we move forward with the work of the university. So thank you, and thank you all.
Everybody ready? Thank you. Thank you. Nice to meet you.